This is Desaliny, and welcome to episode 2 of 90s Overlooked Underheard. Last time we were talking about a couple of bands from the UK. Today, in this episode, we're going to switch to a couple of bands from the USA who were releasing albums at pretty much the same time. But before I do start talking about the records, just a brief explainer to the differences between the UK and the US alternative or indie scene at that time. Very different countries in terms of the media. In the UK, we had lots of national music press, several weekly publications, which you could read wherever you were in the country. So it's very easy for a band to go from 0 to 100 miles an hour in the space of weeks with the right press coverage. The US, a little different. Such a big country, and without a kind of national news network that was covering music in that way, in the same way that things like The Enemy and Melody Maker and Sounds were in the UK, it just meant it was much more difficult for bands to kind of break through. The indie scene was heavily reliant on local geographical scenes. And the big driver of a lot of the indie and alternative music going into the 90s in the USA was the hardcore scene of the previous decade. So for hardcore, read punk. This was the US take on punk rock. And it developed through the 1980s to the point where all these different local scenes were kind of developing their own sound. So a Washington, D.C. hardcore band would sound different to a band from, for instance, Chicago or from San Francisco. The hardcore punk scene was quite regimented. The music was kind of uniformly kind of fast and hard and loud and aggressive, and the crowds were similarly kind of got kind of quite aggressive. It was quite a macho environment. You know, serious kind of mosh pits, stage diving. It could be quite intimidating if you weren't kind of in with the scene, I think. And as the decade wore on, and I think people started pushing up against the limits of what had become a bit of a straitjacket in terms of the hardcore sound, we started to see these kind of post-hardcore bands come through, which had come out of the hardcore scene, but which were taking a slightly different approach, adding a bit more nuance, slowing down, introducing more melody, singing about things in a different way. There wasn't one particular driver of this post-hardcore sound. And again, it was very highly, very localized, as a lot of the American music scene of the time was. Bands could only really manage kind of national tours or regional tours with the help of the connections they would make through other people in scenes in different cities. So by the time we got to the kind of turn of the 80s into the 90s, this kind of post-hardcore scene had already delivered a lot more diversity in the types of music. You were starting to kind of hear bands that would explicitly kind of what they were described as emo. Whether the bands themselves like that label, I'm not sure, but that was one kind of strand of post-hardcore music. There was also this kind of very kind of mordant, abrasive, nihilistic kind of brand of kind of Midwestern punk. Sometimes it was called like the steak and cigars punk, because it was all about being brash and obnoxious and maybe being very confrontational with the kind of lyrics and the kind of content you'd be bringing forward to the music. Then you'd have these kind of strange, psychedelic almost kind of punk bands, I guess. I'm thinking here things like the Butthole Surfers or the Meat Puppets. Bands bringing something that wasn't just straight ahead volume and speed. These were bands that wanted to kind of mess with people's heads a little. And there was also just a kind of broader feeling of people exploring the idea of noise. A noisy kind of rock which, whilst it had its roots in the hardcore punk scene, was looking to express itself differently, was looking to take a more artistic approach, take risks and take chances. I mean, you could argue that one strand of this post-hardcore music would be grunge, which is the one that we most readily identify as being a 90s style of this kind of post-hardcore music. And grunge was basically fusing the hardcore sound with a lot more reverence to classic kind of heavy rock sounds of the late 60s and the mid 70s, that kind of period. But at the same time, people were discovering grunge. There were numerous other underground alternative bands throughout the US who were doing things a little differently. And today we're going to talk about two of them, and specifically the albums that they released in this year. So first up, I'd like to talk about Ben-Hur, which is the second album by Bitch Magnet. I don't have an exact release date for this album, but it was definitely released in 1990. So, Bitch Magnet formed in 1986 and were relatively short-lived. This album, Ben-Hur, that we're talking about, was their last album. They disbanded in 1991, I believe. And the leading light, if you like, of Bitch Magnet was a guy called Soo Young Park, who went on to form a band called Scene. The band were based in North Carolina. And I think you can see signs in this album of it being kind of a precursor to what would later become post-rock. But it's definitely a more driving, harder-edged sound, which put it more in line with grunge. Although, to be honest, it sounds nothing really like grunge. So it was music that featured, as I said, it was more complex music. So you would see these kind of swerving changes in time signature, and songs would go on for either a very long time or they'd be over very quickly. Very hard to kind of pin down sound, very noisy and very precise. And again, using these kind of semi-spoken vocals. It's the kind of sound that you would associate with subsequent records by other bands. The main one I would be thinking of here would be Slint's Spiderland album, which has grown in stature over the years to be recognised as one of the pivotal albums of this period in time. But I think if Ben-Hur has a precedent, if it sounds like anything to do with Slint, it sounds more like Slint's debut album, Tweez, in that it's kind of bittier, it's knottier, but it's a really good listen. Some key tracks would be the opener, for instance, Dragoon, which is this kind of big, epic 9-minute track, which begins like some kind of 70s heavy rock, almost kind of Spinal Tap Stonehenge thing going on with these huge crashing percussion sounds. And it evolves into this sleek kind of driving rock song. It's a fantastic song. I think it's the best on the album. But then they could also compress things into a much tighter space. Opening track on side 2, Mesentery, is just this really short, sharp blast of stop-start noise rock. Very punky, but with this kind of complexity to it, to the structure of the song, that just adds a level of depth that wasn't there in the hardcore band's output of only a few years previously. And then the final song on the album, Crescent, which is much more straightforward and melodic and pointed to the way that Su Yung was going to be taking his next band, Seam, who I've already mentioned. This is the direction they'd be travelling, which was in more of a noisy alternative guitar music, but which was definitely rooted more in melody. So for the second record we'll be talking about today, also released sometime in 1990, I don't have a precise date for this one either, but this is the debut full-length album by Tar, and it's called Roundhouse. So Tar were a Chicago-based band who formed in 1988. Disbanded sometime in the mid-90s, but they have reformed for various one-off shows or festivals over the years. Their first release was it's one of those records which you'd either call a mini album or an EP. I think it was a 5 or 6 track affair called Handsome. But this album, Roundhouse, was their first full length. And it was released through Amphetamine Reptile Records, who were one of the more interesting, I think, US noise rock kind of labels of that period. There are ones that are far better known, like Sub Pop or SST, Touch and Go, Discord. But Amphetamine Reptile were this kind of very abrasive, noisy label that also managed to pick from bands not just in one particular location. A lot of the labels sprung up around kind of cities or regions. And in fact, Amphetamine Reptile was based in Minneapolis, but they tended to sign bands from all over the country. And it kind of felt like the Dirty Dozen of of the American noise rock labels. It felt like they would sign all the people that everyone else was kind of a bit wary about signing. But a fantastically interesting label. But anyway, Tar, they spent some time releasing on Amphetamine Reptile and subsequently released records on Touch and Go. But my first encounter with Tar would have been by this album, and I think a lot of people's first encounter with Tar may have been from this compilation, Ugly American Overkill, which was released in the UK to coincide with a Amphetamine Reptile band's European tour. But anyway, Roundhouse, yeah, the key tracks I would highlight would be the opening track, Les Paul Worries. The sound has got this kind of grinding, relentless, industrial sound. The guitars almost sound kind of robotic, but when I say industrial, I don't mean industrial in terms of drum machines and synthetic sounds. This is kind of a grimy industrial sound, a kind of the sound of heavy industry. Tar is a very telling name for the band. You get the feeling of rust and decay and machinery just running over and over and over. And Les Paul Worries, the opening track, perfectly captures that. Just this buzzing one chord that is just sustained and held for most of the first half of the song's runtime. It just builds up this huge amount of tension. And I think that's one of the things that these bands worked on, was this kind of idea of a tension and release. That's where you find the stop and the start rhythms so much a part of this type of music. Bad Box was the opening track on side 2, and this is the one that featured on the compilation that I just kind of showed you. It's probably their most kind of melodic effort in that it's got a proper verse and a chorus, but it still has this kind of glowering industrial shadow that it casts. It's, if you imagine grunge with all the kind of the heavy rock excesses stripped from it completely, no guitar solos, just very, very direct. Very controlled. A barely kind of suppressed aggression at the center of it. The track on side 2, Gag Reflex, really highlights Tar's strength, which was this kind of, this almost kind of supernatural ability to kind of stop and start on a dime. This track doesn't feature any vocals. It actually uses a sample of just voices intoning lists of numbers. I think it was from these kind of recordings of numbers stations that surfaced over the years. But if you were looking for Tar's signature sound in one track, even though this one doesn't have the vocals, I think Gag Reflex is a very good kind of condensation of everything that Tar were about. A very precise kind of industrial punk sound. There's something about this record that just pulls you in. It sounds raw, it sounds unprocessed, it sounds thrilling. It's a great record. So that's all I have to say for episode 2. There's some stuff down below as usual, and I'll see you again for the next episode of 90s Overlooked Underheard. Thanks for watching.